I'll read you a couple more of these obituaries. This is a mother in Calgary who died in her early 50s, again, cancer. Just look at this. A master at multitasking, she juggled several hockey practices, school board, orchestra, and other extracurricular activities. June 2005 brought terrible news to this mother of three by now president of the Parents' Council at Western Canada College. Emergency surgery revealed metastatic cancer. She refused the cloak of illness. She did not give up on any of her roles. You know, she had all these roles, and they were more important than who she was. She even continued her 5 a.m. bicycle trips around the nearby reservoir. Now imagine that when you're getting chemotherapy. She enrolled in a life coaching course, and upon graduation from the Adler School, she initiated Living Out Loud, a group for women with cancer. That's very typical of people who get chronic disease. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept eating 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. Okay? So that this poor man suffered under the belief that, number one, he was responsible how everybody else felt, and number two, he must never disappoint anybody. So he actually couldn't say to his mother, you know, Mom, I got amazing news. I got 4 kids. And I'm gonna have dinner with them most of the time. Nor could he say to his wife, you know, Rosalind, I'm very close with my mom. She needs my support. So once or twice a week, I'm gonna have dinner with her. He just tried to please everybody all the time. And this need to please everybody all the time, it'll kill you. And for reasons I will tell you. And these reasons are not psychological. They're physiological. They have to do with the body, the immune system, and everything else. You can't separate the mind from the body. And the problem with my profession, the medical profession, is that we make 2 separations that are actually, in life, impossible to make. One is that we separate the mind from the body. We think that people's emotional lives are somehow separate from their physiology. Completely false assumption, unscientific, refuted by all the research, and yet if you go to a doctor, I mean, I know some of you here have had autoimmune illnesses, for example. So ask yourself, when you've been to the physician with your rheumatoid arthritis, your joint being inflamed, or some other rheumatic condition, did anybody ever ask you about your childhood? Anybody ever ask you about your stresses in your life? Anybody ever ask you about your marriage? About how you relate to your work? About how you look after yourself or how you don't? Likely not. Likely what they did is they said, you got this illness, we don't know why you got it, and here are the pills. So they'll give you a medication to suppress the inflammation, or they'll give you a medication because autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body itself, so we give you a medication to suppress the immune system itself. Or we'll give you cortisol or some kind of other steroid. Well, that's all we do. We don't talk about the life factors that may have contributed to the onset of the illness. And I can guarantee you that any of you here who've had chronic illness of any kind, you're going to recognize yourself in this talk completely and 100%. And you're going to wonder, why didn't anybody say this to me before? Because in the West, when I say the West, I mean the dominant Western culture, unlike Aboriginal cultures, unlike the traditional medicines of China or India or native traditions around the world, we separate the mind from the body. So we treat only the body, unless you have mental illness, in which case we still separate the mind from the body. And the other thing we separate is the individual from the environment. As I said to you last night, those of you that were there, you can't separate people from their environment. People are shaped by the environment. And in lifelong interaction with the environment is how human beings live. Now let me give you 3 examples of that. Why you can't separate people from the environment. It's been shown now, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. Now, not controversial. Several studies have shown that. So in polluted areas where there is more asthma, it's the kids of parents who are stressed who are most likely to have the asthma. Now, most doctors have never heard about that. And if they did, they can't explain it. And yet it's so obvious, you see. Those of you that have asthma, anybody had asthma here before in your life? Okay. You were given 2 kinds of inhalers if you had asthma. One inhaler is probably called, and its job is to open up the airways, because what happens in asthma is you get a spasm of the muscles that surround the airways, so you get this narrowing of the tube through which air has to pass into the lungs, so you're wheezing and whistling and laboring your breathing. And the other inhaler you got would have been a steroid to suppress the inflammation, the swelling, and the inflammatory debris that clutters up the airway. So you get 2 inhalers. One is called a bronchodilator to dilate, open up the airway. The other is to suppress the inflammation. Now, what are these inhalers based on? The inhaler that opens up the airway is a copy of adrenaline. And the inhaler that opens up, that suppresses the inflammation is a copy of cortisol. Serve us. What are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones. Exactly. In other words, we're giving asthmatics stress hormones, the same stress hormones that are made by their own adrenal glands when they're stressed. All that's happened is that their own stress response mechanisms have been exhausted, and now we have to give them stress hormones from the outside. Now guess what? If you have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, what will they give you? Cortisol, the stress hormone. Shouldn't we be asking ourselves that if we're treating people with stress hormones, whether or not there might be a connection between stress and their disease? Now, of course, why the children of parents who are stressed? Because the parents' stresses actually program the physiology of the child. Because you can't separate the individual from the environment. And this is true all our lives. A study of women in Australia, 500 women, 550 women, who had lumps in their breasts that were of sufficient concern as to require a biopsy. Now, they had these biopsies, but before the results came back, they also had a psychological interview or a questionnaire. It turns out after the results came back that if a woman had had a significant stressful incident in her life just prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself had 0 effect on whether or not that lump was cancerous. Similarly, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that also had 0 effect. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and had a major stressor, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now, the medical doctors running the study couldn't understand this one either, because they said, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? You see? Because we don't understand the connection between individuals and the environment. Now, here's the deal. If I were to act inappropriately towards you right now, if I were to stress you right now, physically or emotionally, you'd have 3 healthy options. If I were to stress you right now, what would happen is that stress wouldn't just be in your head, it would be in your whole body. You know, your heart rate would go up, your nervous system would be firing off all kinds of impulses, your adrenal glands would be pouring adrenaline and cortisol so that you could escape or fight back. These are the flight or fight hormones. And so your body would be in a different state physiologically in a split second in order to help you fight to escape. That's good. So in the short term, the stress hormones help you fight or to escape. But what do they do in the long term? In the long term, the stress hormones deplete your body, suppress your immune system, give you heart disease, high blood pressure, give you ulcers, thin your bones. Okay? Now, what would happen if you were stressed, something happened that was stressful to you, and you're sitting there all upset about it, and your body's in a state of imbalance and upset, but somebody that you trust came along and said, hey friend, I see that you're not feeling well, I see that you're upset, puts a hand on your shoulder and says, hey, do you want to talk about it? Now, what would happen to your body right away? Yes, it would relax. You'd take a deep breath. Your brain would get oxygen. You'd start thinking more clearly. Your heart rate would slow down. Your blood pressure diminish. The stress hormones abate in your system. And you go back into a healthy balance. All because somebody said, hey buddy, do you want to talk about it? Those women that had been stressed but were emotionally alone, the stress hormone acted on their system for months. That's why they were more likely to get cancer. It's really straightforward. In other words, again, the physiology of one individual can't be separated from their psychological and social environment. And finally, at the end of life, a study in a major medical journal a few years ago showed that amongst elderly couples, when one of them is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They get sick. In other words, the risk of illness goes up in the other one when the one is hospitalized. Why? Because our immune systems are not isolated from our psychological, emotional, social relationships. You can't separate the mind from the body, and you can't separate the individual from the environment. Just illustrated with a disease I'm quite interested in because, again, medical science says we don't know the cause of it, and I think that it's only because we're not looking.
Thank you for listening. I love you.